everybody, happy Friday. It's Brandon Bustede. Thanks for joining me for the second LinkedIn Live edition of Bold Leaders in Learning. And I'm delighted today to have one of my good colleagues, Dr. Alvin Bisarya, here with me. He's the Vice President of Eye, Human Patients and Healthcare Innovation at Kaplan. And Alvin happens to be one of the most popular guys around these days because of the work that he's leading at Eye, Human Patients. So delighted to have you here, Alvin. Thanks for carving out the time on a Friday. And I would love to just start with the basics. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work, and then tell folks about Eye, Human Patients. We're gonna talk a little bit about it as part of this session today, but I think it's important for everybody to be kind of grounded in what the heck it is that we're discussing. So in any event, would love to hear a little bit more about you.
Well, thanks very much, Brandon, and thanks for having me on your live stream here. I've been in healthcare and education in one way, shape, or form for about 15 years now. My background is as a physician. I trained as a physician at Northwestern. Spent a number of years working in the hospital and pharmaceutical industry with McKinsey. And throughout, though, was spending time in education, the education practice there, as well as in a number of ed and ed tech companies since then. And I've been with Kaplan for 5 years and leading iHuman for the last year or so. And again, I'm really pleased to be here because it is a moment for our company, our division of Kaplan. iHuman has been in the business of virtual patient simulation, and I'll define that in a moment, for about 8 years. So you could say that we've been preparing for this moment for the better part of a decade. What is virtual patient simulation? Simulation, I think, has a lot of connotation. The easiest way to think about what we do is it's a brute force analogy is as a flight simulator. So just as pilots get into flight simulations that are highly realistic and allow them to fly very sophisticated pieces of machinery, doctors and nurses need simulation of all kinds so that they can practice safely prior to actually performing on a patient. iHuman's niche within that world is simulating the cognitive processes behind the clinical and diagnostic steps it takes to actually solve for what a patient is going through and treat them. So it's a simulation of the mind, enhanced through our online platform, which we'll show you in a minute. And I actually think that's the best way to experience what this is. We recently created a case. That's how we think of our business. We have over 300 cases, each of which represents a different diagnostic scenario. And we recently created one, as you might expect, for coronavirus, a COVID-19 case. And what you're going to see in this clip that we'll show you here is introduction to case play. And one of our lead content creator, our Vice President of Content and Medical Creation, Dr. Judy Kalaniak, who has 20 years at UCSF and Stanford that she brings to our team. And she leads a group of students through the beginning of that case. And this is a short 30-second clip of that. So if we could see that now, that would be a good way to show you what we mean by simulation.
I'm Dr. Kalaniak at Eye, Human Patients by Kaplan, and today we're going to try to diagnose Mark Webb. Does he have influenza? Does he have COVID-19?
We're introduced to the patient just like you might in a real-world scenario. And I'll let the clip play here so that you can see how the avatar pops up, and there's some interaction with the students.
We have to make a diagnosis. Is it a slam dunk? It would be unusual to have.
One of the things you'll notice is that there's not only an avatar that you can interact with, you can speak to the avatar, ask it questions, but you're asked to perform again the cognitive processes, listing out the problems that the patient is talking about, and starting to formulate what's called the differential. What are the list of things that could possibly be wrong? In this particular case, what we have done is set up a quandary that is facing millions of healthcare professionals today. Is it flu or is it coronavirus? The treatment paths are really, really different. But more than that, the safety of not just that patient, but numerous lives are at stake. If it is coronavirus, you have to make some decisions about where you are going to triage that patient to. If it's flu, it's a whole different scenario. So that's what these medical students went through to distinguish between the two and then come up with the right diagnostic and treatment procedure. The other thing I'd want to point out with this simulation is that it's up to date. So why is that important? Many diseases are stable over time, over thousands of years. Anatomy is stable over thousands of years. Here is a great example of where it is virtually impossible to train somebody in the clinic on this problem without the assistance of a virtual scenario. That person won't be as effective because you actually don't have the knowledge to do it. It's not out there yet. In a virtual simulation, you can build in that knowledge very, very quickly, get that person the practice that they need so that they can come in and be effective with patients.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I mean, obviously, it's apparent that something like iHuman Patients has a lot of value when everything is shut down out there right now, right? There are no clinical rotations happening, right? In the absence of that, what do, right? This is obviously filling a huge void to allow medical training on many fronts to move forward. But even in the absence of a COVID disruption, right, in terms of physically being shut down, you've got something new that has developed in the the medical realm, and this is where virtual simulation really comes to the forefront as one of the quickest and most effective ways to kind of deploy to the front, if you will. I was on that webinar, by the way, where they did the COVID-19 demonstration. I was thinking to myself, I'm a huge fan of House, the series, and I was like, man, I can be House. I can play Dr. House here and make my own differential diagnosis. So tell me a little bit about how this is playing out. I mean, I know it's being applied in nursing training, physician's assistants for doctors. Give me a sense of what was happening before the COVID disruption, because obviously you guys have been at this for a while, and then tell me what has really changed beyond the obvious with what's happening right now during this disruption.
Sure. So what was happening before was that there was a lot of interest being generated in virtual simulation really anyway, for a lot of the same reasons. Most of simulation as it's known today is known as mannequin-based simulation or SimLab-based simulation, where you actually have a physical mannequin that you can manipulate and learn various procedures, learn some of the thinking on. But virtual simulation was coming to the fore over the last year or so, especially in undergraduate nursing, but across all of the main areas that you mentioned, because the power of being able to develop and get people that deliberate practice that we know learning science points us to. So the 10,000 hour rule, as we know now, has some nuance to it. And virtual simulation was playing into this pre-COVID. So what do I mean by that? When you talk about 10,000 hours and getting those reps, the way that happens today is generally some form of preclinical education that sets you up for that deliberate practice. And then you go into, as you mentioned, a hospital or non-acute care setting, and you start building those reps. You start seeing patients and so forth. And in some ways, there's no better way to do that. In some ways, though, we know that standardized patient actors are very, very helpful. They help get you more reps in a safe manner, safe for the patients and safe for you. So This is all pre-COVID.
Yep.
But what virtual simulation does is actually make that process a lot more efficient and strategic. So what do we mean by that? Efficiency comes because you can get what's called the deliberate practice done, the practice that's focused with appropriate feedback. And this is what you see with every athlete, Tiger Woods and Earl Woods, and the Eastern Bloc with tennis players, and pick your discipline. Violinists at the Boston Philharmonic. Every genre or every discipline shows that if you have that deliberate practice with the feedback from an expert,
right,
that's what counts. And so virtual simulation provides that in spades. The other piece about strategic, though, is when you go into the hospital, it's kind of catch as catch can. Today, there may be 12 patients with pulmonary edema. Tomorrow, there may be 12 with heart attacks. You have an uneven experience. Virtual simulation pre-COVID was already filling the gaps. So now shift here to post-COVID, and what's different than the obvious, as you said. Safety becomes a much, much bigger deal.
Yep.
Not only for the patients, you want people to have the general medical practice in medical school, and this is slightly different in nursing, is and this is a provocative statement, but it's see one, do one, teach one. Not until you teach are you really able to lock that in. Now, what do you do when you, one, can't teach because you don't know, and two, teaching becomes dangerous to especially the novice folks, our junior medical students, our junior nursing students? It's as if, to use a war metaphor, you skip basic training and send the soldiers out to the war. Nobody ever does that. Even in wartime, we never do that. And here, if you do that, you're literally putting patients' lives at risk and the medical providers' lives at risk. So that deliberate practice, the value of that increases exponentially in a situation like this. So that's the pre and the post.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have to wonder too, right? Everybody's trying to think through, as a result of this disruption, right? What does it look like, the new norm or whatever we want to call it? I mean, obviously, I think most of us have recognized that we're not going to go back in most things to the exact norm that was before this, right? There's going to be some modification for either a period of time or indefinitely, right? Like, is business travel really going to return fully ever again? I mean,
Right.
Really good questions to wrestle with. So as you kind of forecast out in front, through, the major part of this disruption, 18 months, 24 months from now, we've got a vaccine, let's say, and we've largely figured out how to moderate the effects of this. What do you think happens with virtual simulation? Like, I'm curious about other things too, like licensing boards and standards, right? Is there conversation about a shift there from the percentage of time that has to be required in clinical rotations versus simulations? Just tell me a little bit about your, say, 18-month to 24-month forecast out in front.
Yeah. So 18 to 24 months. Let's start with the last point you made in accreditation boards and licensing boards. And as we know and we see, and I think most of us, if we think about it for a little bit, we would agree that medicine moves slow, and it really should move slow. We don't want to, and we'll take, we can look at the hydroxychloroquine, impact right now. We've done more studies now. We've seen what the impact is. It takes time for medicine to evolve, and it should, because patients' lives are being impacted. That said, a moment like this forces innovation, and licensing board and accrediting boards have now gone out and said, virtual simulation has a role to play, probably larger than we actually acknowledged in the past. That's really important, because we need people who have the deliberate thought process to ask and answer the question, is this safe? Is this effective? Even when it comes to an educational tool, to be answering those questions, and they are. So that's tied to the 18 to 24 month view. In a world where there is a vaccine and there is a recession of the threat of coronavirus, what we're seeing factually is that certainly for the next 6 to 12 months, deans, faculty, students are conservative about the future. They feel they will need to have this as at least a backup, if not a frontline solution, because of the possibility of recurrence. Long term, because this modality is getting so much exposure, I don't think there is any going back. Now that you know that you can actually use this tool, at least as an adjunct and perhaps as a frontline educational tool, we see ourselves and others who are providing this service as mainstays of the educational format in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. You know this well, right? But the other big discussion that's raging across higher ed and K-12 is this one of the fact that in the last 2 months, essentially a billion students across the planet were thrust into hastily, made ad hoc distance learning solutions. I don't even want to call them online, because I've got a third and a fourth grader here, and it basically involves printing out worksheets on my printer. Mm-hmm. That's what distance learning is. So, but and so some folks have said, wow, this exposure to hastily, poorly done, kind of bubble gum, and duct tape solutions is going to turn people off from online education. There's the other group who's saying, well, no, actually, it's going to improve the familiarity with it, even though a lot of people are going to have disproportionately poor experiences. But like, when I look at something like iHuman Patients, which is on the absolute cutting edge of this, right, realizing the sophistication of the technology, how real it is, how adaptive it is, right? My thesis is that we're going to see people who are exposed during this time to world-class online education and simulation and really poorly done stuff. And then there's going to be conversation like, well, what do you mean that was that bad? Because I did something over here that was unbelievable. I'm just curious, like, I'm giving you a bit of a question that you're biased towards because of your role, but tell me how you think that's going to play out, this confluence of really bad experiences and what I would call world-class experience with online.
Yeah, I think, as you're saying, it's really depends upon the segment and the job to be done, if you will, to take from Clayton Christensen. I mean, I too have a 7 and 10-year-old who I'm having to print out worksheets for, and there's various kinds of suggestions to use online pieces, but it's very fragmented. I think the thing that, as you said, we're biased, but the thing that we come to this moment with is almost, again, a decade of thinking about how to do this well. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of people are facing, is that they haven't had that moment. They haven't had that need. We saw a need almost a decade ago and have been attacking it ever since. And so, like anything else, we have engineers in Silicon Valley, we have top clinicians from across the country. That when you have that kind of mind power working at a single problem for this long, I think you're going to see the kind of solution that really works. Furthermore, I think when you have this many people using things like simulation, and this is happening in the athletics fitness world as well. This is happening in other areas. I think you're going to see more innovation and innovators drawn to it, like Kaplan, and investing to accelerate that even further. So where there's fragmentation and maybe not a head start like we have, I think you're going to see the impact that you and I are seeing as parents / teachers, homeschooling perhaps without the intent to do that. But in the medical world, I think this is going to draw investment, innovation, mind share, and you're seeing it already.
Yeah, it's for sure. I mean, it reminds me too of some of the other things that I've learned across the Kaplan work with test prep, right? Most people know Kaplan as test prep. That was our historical, founding base and mission. And, I was just surprised. I mean, not shocked, but surprised to learn that, our live online test prep courses, a majority of our students are now in live online test prep, even though they, at least pre-COVID, had the choice between classroom, live classroom and live online. And then the more interesting part is that in addition to most of the market choosing online over classroom, the net promoter scores of the live online test prep students are higher. And you go, well, how can that be? And then when you start to understand the elements that underpin it, it makes sense, because we're able to put our absolute best rock star test prep instructors in front of more students. And then the way the technology is set up is if students have questions, they can go into side chat rooms and have one-on-one discussions with a tutor or TA, right? So it's arguably more personal than a classroom-based session. And the odds are, although all of our instructors are very, very good at what they do, the odds are you've got your absolute, rock stars in front of more students. So, these are examples where I actually believe, in some respects, the online applications, the simulations are actually better purposed, right? I would never call it a replacement, but that I have a lot of hope around. And in general, I think there's just going to be not just the immediate need because of temporary shutdowns, but then the recognition, just like business travel. One of the things I've come to realize, I averaged about 175 flight segments a year for the past 15, 20 years. I'm always on airplanes. I don't know that I'll get back to half of that ever again, because everybody has become much more accepting of exactly what you and I are doing here, right? We're having a video Zoom call. That I really need to physically fly to campus? In some cases, that'll make a big difference. But, I think 50% of the cases where I actually physically went somewhere, if I question it, like, could I do it another way? I'm going to go, yeah, I could do it from home on Zoom. So what else do you see in the in the medical landscape specifically, right? You're interacting with a lot of folks in the field, a lot of medical institutions. What else is happening in the landscape that you think is promising for the future?
Well, in terms of medical education, I think virtual is just one way to go at it. I think we could see further innovation in virtual simulation. Of course, I mean there's also virtual reality, augmented reality, et cetera, and those are all frontiers that are there. We're also seeing a lot of changes in testing, as you mentioned. We're seeing that just like the SAT and ACT have looked at going fully online with proctored exams. I mean, schools are forced to do that. And then how do you do that with an anatomy exam? I heard an anecdote of a local school here in Chicago that set up their anatomy final in the parking lot with face mask and hazmat, and the students couldn't leave their cars. Now, that could work for some folks, but
that's serious, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's another ripe for innovation problem. How do you test? And they need to be high stakes tests, right? These are the folks that are going to take care of our grandparents, our parents, ourselves, our children, and we don't have that at scale yet. And we don't really have a scale solution. And I think these are things that Kaplan are looking at as well. So testing also. I think we know that the USMLE has decided to go pass-fail. And what does that mean about the future as well? Are there other ways that medical students are going to have to, and nursing as well, with the next gen NCLEX? Are they going to have to, is their whole way of doing education going to be different? And is there room for online education to enhance that, distance learning to enhance that? Absolutely. Giving people different experiences, et cetera. So there's a lot of innovation and fields or change in the field that's happening right now that are independent of coronavirus. And I think, and like a lot of thought leaders have said, it's being accelerated by coronavirus, not really fundamentally changing what was happening already.
Yeah, it's interesting. For those of you who are just tuning in, we're talking with Dr. Alvin Bisarya, Vice President of iHuman Patients and Head of Healthcare Innovation at Kaplan, and we've been talking a lot about what they've been doing, their work in medical simulation, and we're also segueing to what things do we see on the horizon. Maybe let's just kind of broaden the discussion for the last few minutes here, Alvin. Look, a lot of prognostication around what the future of higher education looks like. We know, for example, a lot of higher ed institutions have massive medical establishments attached to them, right? We know that there aren't a lot of, in fact, in most states, there are no, surgeries being done outside of, treating COVID-19 patients and trying to cope with the strain on the system. So there's a lot of hospitals and medical centers that are struggling during this time. I'm curious, what's your prediction in terms of how hard we get hit at the higher ed level and at the hospital level? Are we really going to see a mass extinction of higher ed institutions? Are we going to see the similar collapse of actually having fewer hospital beds available in the future? I would love your input on that stuff, even though I know I'm pushing you beyond your specific zone of expertise, but with your broad understanding of higher ed and the healthcare industry, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So a couple of thoughts on higher ed when it comes to medical schools and nursing schools for the future. I'll tie that into hospital beds. So one thing we see, broadly speaking, is a shift from acute care to non-acute settings in general. We know that hospital care is expensive, and so now there's higher acuity patients that go into the hospital, and we've seen a shift to be able to take care of as many as possible outside of the hospital. This would obviously accelerate that. If you can take care of this thing outside of a hospital setting, that's better for every stakeholder in the system.
Right.
So how does that impact medical school, nursing school, et cetera? I think what you'll see from a curriculum perspective, and I know we're talking bigger than this, but telemedicine has to be a part of this. Rural healthcare has to be a part of this. Can you do things like remote dermatology? Can you do things like remote surgery? It's much more obvious with things like radiology and so forth, right? So, but that shift to what can be remote has now a epidemiological engine behind it that was, again, already moving. So what would this mean for medical school and nursing school? When you look at, and you were touching on this, what I would call is the Pelotonization of faculty. star faculty being able to teach at scale is something that Peloton and others do well. Now, do people believe that in higher ed? Let's look at this. We can look at Coursera. We can look at other players in the field. We can look at MIT and edX and so forth. What I think we can see with medical schools is a lot more tangible, and you can see this on forums like Reddit and so forth, is, okay, the basic science, the kind of basic construct of preclinical basic sciences, postclinical in the wards, can that be scaled out? Is there a way to take the top folks, and I know Andy and yourself talk about this, and kind of combine the education with some kind of actual industry recognized way of looking at this? I think there is opportunity for that. Let's take this to an extreme, and this is something that people is just thinking out loud, but from places that we've seen other competitors go in. Is there a global medical school that does the top first 2 years online?
Right.
Is that possible? I think it's more possible now. It's more within, people often say, things like this are, when you don't anticipate them, it's a failure of imagination.
Yeah.
So there's extremes that I think are more real now than more than ever.
No, I think you're right. No one would have ever considered the possibility of that. Now, I think it's definitely in the realm of consideration. And, I've been having a lot of conversations with higher ed leaders who, they've you use a lot of analogies here or taking the gloves off, right? Like there aren't any sacred cows anymore, and considering, hey, should we have an online bachelor's degree? Many have gone and developed online master's degrees, but what about an online bachelor's degree for traditional age students? And then what was the student experience design around that? Because I know one of the other things we've learned a lot of lessons about is I think about this in the apprenticeship training work that we do in the UK. We have essentially what we call technical tutors, the teachers who teach you the technical skill sets that you need to learn in a field. And then we have talent coaches who are really the people that are doing the soft skill development with these individuals. And so, there's a lot of different ways to think about breaking up teaching as well. I always thought about it through the lens of you've got a world-renowned expert, right, who's a tenured faculty member who is absolutely the top expert in their field, but they're not passionate about classroom teaching, right? Or it's just not something that they want to spend a lot of their time doing. Why haven't we had more examples, even in the classroom, of partnering a subject matter expert with somebody who really just wants to focus on, the art of teaching and the science of teaching, right? And combining those, in this case, two different individuals with different talents. But I think that's also where, we start to see more innovation in the models, right? What would a first couple of years of online medical school look like? I'm reminded of one of my friends, their daughter just started medical school, and she was talking about the lectures that they have on Fridays. And she said, well, a third of the class doesn't show up, a third attends, and the other third basically either does one of two things. They go home and they watch the video on 2-speed, so they speed it up. And then there's the group that actually slows it down, replays the video, so it's like you got the group that talk faster. Right. Some don't want to even show up in class, some do. And I just think it starts to tell you there's a lot of different learners too who have different preferences with this. And as we have more comfort with some of these new modalities, I just think I'm encouraged. I think there's going to be an awful lot of innovation. There already has, but I think now a lot of the resistance points to it have been, brought down considerably. And we'll continue to see some crappy stuff out there for sure. But the innovation, I think, is really going to raise the bar, and the visibility of that is going to force everybody to, a higher degree of excellence around it. So, I want to thank you for your time today. Thank you for your leadership in this incredibly innovative field. And I know right now, you couldn't have a bigger mission, Alvin, you and your team, helping all the medical professionals to be the best that they can. And, look, one of the things that could come from this too is a resurgence in interest in the fields of nursing and in medicine more generally. So I'm curious, do you think we'll see a surge in interest in fields in the medical field as a result of this pandemic?
I think disease hunting and epidemiology will be part of the top 3, top 5, and I think infectious disease overall has not been something that people have thought about, even in medicine. I mean, it's thought of as an anachronism, because there's the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, and of course there's Ebola, but it's all over there. or in the past. I don't think that's going to be the case in the future.
Yeah. You wonder, data science has been the hottest job in the U.S. for the last 3 years, and you wonder if we might start to see epidemiology and virology and a whole bunch of other things come up on that list. But, anyway, good to end on a hopeful note, especially on a Friday. And we haven't talked about it yet, but I'm curious if you've done your CrossFit WOD yet today, or if that's still
on your... I have not. That's coming later today. Thanks for asking.
All right, that's good.
Well, to left.
Yeah. For those of you into CrossFit, Alvin is a diehard, and he and I share a lot of CrossFit stories. So, Alvin, thank you very much for the time today. Really appreciated having you.
Thanks, Brandon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.